Take a look at the smartphone in your pocket. Its journey to you is probably more international than any diplomat. The coltan in the battery was probably mined in the Congo, the processor designed in the United States and built in Taiwan, and the whole thing put together and assembled in China or India. It was then put on a ship flying a Panamanian flag, navigating through international shipping lanes protected by international agreements, using a GPS system coordinated by multiple governments. How does this impossibly complex global ballet work in a world without an international government? The invisible system of rules, standards, and agreements is what we call global governance, and it's the hidden force that makes modern life possible. And if you stop to think about it, most of the major problems we face today are global as well. Pandemics don't stop at borders, neither does climate change, terrorism, or financial collapse. In a world of nearly 200 sovereign states, how do we respond to problems that no one country can solve alone? What, in other words, does global cooperation look like when there's no one in charge? So let's start with a basic question. What exactly is global governance? In simple terms, global governance refers to the ways that the international community, states, organizations, and even non-state actors work together to solve problems that cross borders and affect us all. It's a system of rules, norms, and processes that facilitate international cooperation and manage issues that transcend national borders. It's not about who rules the world, because in truth, no one does. There's no global government, no world president, no Supreme Court of planet Earth. What we have instead is a patchwork of rules, institutions, norms, and processes that try to bring some order to a very chaotic international system. Global governance is how countries coordinate their behavior in the absence of a world authority. You can think of it as a toolkit we use to manage collective problems. Institutions like the United Nations or the World Health Organization, treaties and legal agreements like the Paris Climate Accords, norms and expectations like the idea that states shouldn't commit genocide, and forums for diplomacy like the G20 or the UN General Assembly. These mechanisms aren't perfect. Indeed, they're often painstakingly slow, highly politicized, and profoundly unfair. But without them, we're left with a world where every country is on its own trying to solve global problems in isolation. Because in the end, global governance isn't about control, it's about coordination, trying to shape behavior and solve shared problems in a world where there's no supreme authority, only competing sovereigns. It's what happens when nearly 200 independent countries, all with different interests and power, try to navigate a planet full of shared risks and limited resources. When countries engage with the world, they have several options for how to cooperate or choose not to. To understand global governance, we need to look at the three core approaches: unilateralism, bilateralism, and multilateralism. These aren't just different diplomatic strategies. They reflect how much control a country wants to retain, how much influence it can exert, and how it balances independence with cooperation. Unilateralism means acting alone, making decisions and taking actions without consulting others. It's often faster and more flexible since there's no need to negotiate, compromise, or try to reach consensus. But it can also be risky, as it may isolate states diplomatically, provoke backlash, or undermine collective solutions to shared problems. An example of unilateralism might be the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was launched without formal UN approval or broad international support. Unilateral strategies are most often favored by powerful states, those with enough military, economic, or diplomatic weight to act independently without fear of consequences. Bilateralism involves two states cooperating directly on trade deals, security arrangements, or diplomatic agreements. It's often more efficient than broader multilateral efforts since it involves fewer actors and simpler negotiations. But it can also create power asymmetries, where a larger, more powerful country can set the terms and dominate the relationship, especially when its smaller partner lacks leverage. A good example of this might be the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, which replaced NAFTA. The agreement was negotiated as a series of bilateral agreements that ultimately became trilateral, but the US used its weight to pressure both neighbors separately. Finally, multilateralism involves three or more countries working together, usually through formal organizations or treaties, to solve problems that affect them all. It's the most complex and slowest form of diplomacy, but it also holds the greatest promise for building long-term, stable solutions to global challenges like climate change, pandemics, or nuclear proliferation. But not all multilateral cooperation is created equal. International relations scholar John Rudge draws an important distinction between multilateralism in practice, any situation involving multiple states, and multilateralism as a principle, which is defined by three key features. Indivisibility, meaning the problem is a single whole that cannot be divided up. Peace or stable climate is indivisible. You can't provide it to just one country without providing it for others. As a result, these are examples of the collective action problem we discussed in an earlier video. Second, multilateralism in principle centers on generalized principles of conduct or shared rules that apply equally to all members. And third, it involves diffuse reciprocity, meaning cooperation is based on long-term mutual benefit rather than on immediate transactional payoffs. This kind of rule-based, inclusive multilateralism is the backbone of global governance. Institutions like the United Nations, the Paris Climate Agreement, or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty all embody this approach, though sometimes imperfectly. A country's preference for unilateral, bilateral, or multilateral strategies often depends on its relative power. Great powers like the United States, China, and Russia often lean towards unilateral or bilateral strategies. These give them more control, let them shape outcomes on their own terms, and avoid being constrained by multilateral rules they didn't write. By contrast, smaller and mid-sized states like Canada, Norway, Chile, or the members of the African Union tend to favor multilateralism, as it gives them a voice in shaping the global agenda, helps build coalitions, and offers a way to balance against larger powers. And in a world where power is unequally distributed, multilateral institutions can level the playing field, at least in theory, by creating rules that all countries are expected to follow. But multilateralism comes with trade-offs. It's often slow and hard to enforce. Powerful states can sometimes ignore the rules or dominate the process. And reaching consensus among dozens or hundreds of countries can be exhausting. Still, when it works, multilateralism can provide broad legitimacy, durable cooperation, and shared accountability, the kinds of tools that global governance depends on. We've defined global governance as how countries work together through approaches like multilateralism. But that raises a bigger question. Why do we need global governance at all? After all, the international system is built on sovereignty, the idea that states have the right to govern themselves without outside interference. Why would states ever give up some of their autonomy to follow shared rules or submit to international institutions? The answer is simple. Because the problems we face today don't stop at borders. Cooperation, therefore, becomes a matter of national interest. States agree to follow shared rules not out of pure altruism, but because they calculate that the benefits of the stable, predictable system outweigh the costs of total autonomy. In the past, it might have been possible for countries to go alone. But in the modern world, what happens in one part of the globe often affects everyone else. Economies are interconnected. Information moves instantly. Pollution in one country changes the climate for us all. Disease outbreaks spread across continents in days. Conflict in one region can create refugee problems in another. In international relations, we call this interdependence, the growing web of connections that links countries, economies, peoples, and problems. And in an interdependent world, no single country has the power or the capacity to manage all of these issues on their own. That's where global governance comes in. Global governance tries to coordinate shared responsibilities and responses to shared challenges, set standards and rules of behavior, promote cooperation, reduce conflict, and provide a mechanism for accountability, negotiation, and sometimes even enforcement. It helps countries pool resources, share information, and develop collective strategies, even when their individual interests don't always align. Of course, global governance is far from perfect. There is no global government. As a result, participation is voluntary and enforcement is often weak. And countries have different priorities, values, and levels of power. What seems fair to one state might seem like domination to another. Even more, sovereignty still matters. Many states are deeply reluctant to give up authority over what happens inside their borders, even when cooperation is clearly in their long-term interests. But consider the alternative. What happens when there's no coordination? climate agreements fall apart, conflicts escalate unchecked, and rich countries hoard vaccines while others wait. Without global governance, the risk of fragmentation, inequality, insecurity, and chaos are clear. So, even though the system is messy and flawed, it's still the best tool we have to confront global challenges in a shared, coordinated way. It's not about creating a world government. It's about creating a world where independent states can work together, solve problems, and hold each other accountable without needing to give up their sovereignty entirely. To see how this plays out, let's look at two real-world examples, one where global governance struggled and one where it succeeded. The COVID-19 pandemic was a stress test for global governance, and in many ways, it exposed the system's weaknesses. Early in the pandemic, the World Health Organization coordinated information sharing, issued guidelines, and helped distribute testing kits and medical supplies. But as the crisis deepened, cooperation gave way to competition. Some countries closed borders without coordination, others hoarded vaccines, leaving low-income countries behind. Misinformation, nationalism, and distrust undermined the global response. This was a clear example of a beggar-thy-neighbor policy and vaccine nationalism, where states prioritized their own immediate gains at the expense of a coordinated global recovery. As a result, the health crisis lasted longer, hit vulnerable populations harder, and deepened inequalities, especially between the global north and the global south. The pandemic demonstrated that global problems demand global solutions, but the problem is that without trust and political will, even well-intentioned institutions can fall short. Now contrast that with a story of successful global governance, the fight to protect the ozone layer. In the early 1980s, scientists discovered that chemicals called CFCs, found in refrigerators, air conditioners, and aerosol sprays, were creating a massive hole in the ozone layer, exposing life on Earth to harmful ultraviolet radiation. In response, countries came together to negotiate the Montreal Protocol in 1987. It was a multilateral agreement that phased out ozone-depleting substances. Most scholars argue that the protocol was successful for three primary reasons. First, the science connecting CFCs and the hole in the ozone layer was clear and widely accepted. Second, countries saw a shared interest in acting quickly. And third, the agreement was flexible, creating funds to help developing countries adapt and spurring innovation that made chemical alternatives economically competitive. As a result of the agreement, the ozone layer is healing, and the Montreal Protocol offers a rare and hopeful example of how effective global governance can work. The theoretical perspectives we considered early in the course offer very different interpretations of global governance in action. You should remember from our earlier videos that for realists, the international system is defined by anarchy, not chaos, but the absence of higher authority above states. States are the main actors. They're rational, self-interested, and concerned first and foremost with survival. In this view, cooperation is hard to sustain, especially when it threatens a state's autonomy or security. From a realist perspective, global governance often reflects the interests of the most powerful states. Institutions like the United Nations may exist, but they don't constrain great powers, they serve them. The structure of the UN Security Council reflects realist thinking. Its 5 permanent members, the US, China, Russia, the UK, and France, each have a veto power. That's not about fairness, it's about power. As a result, realists are skeptical of global governance. States participate when it serves the national interest, but they'll abandon cooperation the moment it doesn't. For their part, liberals generally agree that the international system is anarchic, but see more room for cooperation. They argue that states have multiple interests, not just power and security, but also economic growth, stability, and reputation. And in a deeply interconnected world, cooperation isn't just possible, it's necessary. That's where institutions come in. Organizations like the UN, the WTO, or the WHO don't eliminate anarchy, but they make cooperation easier by reducing uncertainty, promoting information sharing, establishing rules and norms around behavior, and monitoring compliance by states. Over time, liberals believe institutions can create habits of cooperation, even among rivals. Liberals would argue that even without a world police, the Paris Agreement creates a powerful mechanism for cooperation. It establishes norms of behavior, requires states to publicly report their emissions, promoting transparency, and uses naming and shaming to create reputational costs for failing to meet commitments. For liberals, this is how you build cooperation in an anarchic world. While critics of liberalism argue that when enforcement is weak, as in the Paris Agreement, shared norms may not be enough to drive meaningful action, liberalism nevertheless sees global governance as a rational, beneficial response to interdependence, as a way to help states solve problems and achieve more by working together. Other theoretical traditions offer valuable and often critical insights to global governance. Constructivists emphasize that international institutions and rules are not just shaped by material interests, but by shared ideas, norms, and identities. Global governance, in this view, reflects evolving social expectations about what states ought to do. For example, the global norm against landmines, reflected in the Ottawa Treaty, emerged not from power politics, but from sustained advocacy by civil society and the reframing of landmines as inhumane. Marxists see global governance as tools of capitalist domination, arguing that international institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank entrench global inequality by advancing the interests of wealthy industrialized states and multinational corporations. Feminist scholars critique global governance for marginalizing care work, informal economies, and the lived experiences of women and gender minorities, highlighting how power operates not just between states, but through structures of patriarchy and exclusion. And post-colonial theorists similarly challenge the idea of global governance as being neutral or universal, pointing instead to its historical roots in imperialism and how its supposed universal norms often reflect Western priorities, creating a system where former colonies are expected to play by rules they had no hand in writing. So, where does all that leave us? We live in a world where the biggest problems, climate change, pandemics, migration, conflict, inequality, don't stop at national borders. But we also live in a world built around state sovereignty, national interests, and power politics. Global governance is the system we've built to bridge that gap. It's messy, slow, and often frustrating, but it's also essential. It's not perfect, but it remains one of the best tools we have for coordination and shared problem solving. And in an interconnected world, no country can go alone. Global governance isn't just a theory. It's the institutions, the treaties, the norms, the practices that shape how countries and people interact every day. And at the heart of it all is perhaps the most visible and most ambitious of these, the institution of the United Nations. In our next video, we'll take a closer look at how the UN works, its structure, its goals, and the tensions that have defined it since the day it was founded.